I hadn't even touched my wedding dinner when the text came in. The band had just started some jazzy slow dance version of Can't Take My Eyes Off You. Lena was laughing with her maid of honor. Someone had popped the second bottle of Prosecco, and I was still trying to remember where I left my tie. My jacket was slung over the back of the chair, the collar of my shirt damp from sweat and champagne. That's when I felt it, the buzz. My phone lit up. Preston Redmond. It wasn't a congratulations, wasn't a joke, wasn't even long. Effective immediately, your role has been terminated. No punctuation, just that. I didn't say anything. I just stared at it like the words were going to rewrite themselves if I looked long enough. Lena saw my face before I could hide it. She was mid-laugh, then paused, eyes narrowing the way only someone who truly knows you can read that quick shift. She mouthed, "What is it?" I shook my head, pocketed the phone. I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to ruin the night, and maybe some sick part of me didn't want to believe it. But that was the moment I knew that I'd just gotten married and lost the job I'd given the last 9 years of my life to. Before I go, deeper drop a like so I know this isn't just my story. Comment where you're watching from. My name is Grant Holden. I'm 42. Until that message, I was the senior systems architect at Aperture West Design Group. I built the infrastructure that kept the entire firm compliant, scalable, and profitable. The thing they sold to city officials to win every municipal contract. The thing they pitched to investors like it was some clean, effortless process. What they never said, that I built it after hours. That I tuned every API to city compliance updates by hand. That every digital permit zoning forecast and interdepartmental approval flowed through a logic map I designed in a garage with 2 fans and a whiteboard. What Preston never understood was that it didn't run itself. He's the CEO's son, Charles Redmond's golden boy. Got promoted to managing director 3 weeks before my wedding. Said we needed to modernize, trim the old guard, rethink legacy workflows. Which in practice meant anyone over 35 who didn't post updates on Slack every 40 minutes got quietly reviewed. But I wasn't part of the old guard. I built the guard. I was the guard. They didn't even wait until Monday. That text, no call, no HR signature, no handoff plan, wasn't a mistake. It was theater. Preston needed a public execution, something he could spin to the board as bold and disruptive. And my wedding night, perfect timing, too public to argue, too personal to react. He thought I'd be too stunned, too humiliated, too newly married to strike back. He wasn't entirely wrong, at least for a while. I sat back down, slid the phone screen down beside my untouched plate. The roast chicken was already going cold. The rosemary smelled like sawdust. Lena leaned in. "Is it your mom?" I nodded. Not a good lie, but she let it go. I kept glancing at that phone all night, not because I was waiting for a follow-up, there wouldn't be one, but because I couldn't stop thinking about everything I'd built, still ticking inside a machine that just tried to erase me. I never deleted that text. I backed it up, printed it, even encrypted a copy inside the old staging server, like some twisted digital obituary, not to mourn it, to remember. Because that was the moment I stopped thinking of Aperture West as home. I had no desk, no badge, no farewell lunch, just a text, 12 words. And a system still running on decisions only I understood. It takes a certain kind of arrogance to fire the man who built your foundation. Preston thought I'd beg to stay. Thought I'd flinch, panic, maybe even call Charles to appeal. I didn't, because somewhere between the 5th toast and that last dance, I realized something they hadn't. They fired the wrong version of me. They fired the tired, loyal version, the one who stayed late, fixed silent failures at 3 a.m., and kept my head down while half the firm forgot how things actually worked. The version they fired would have taken it. The version that got up the next morning and poured a black coffee without checking his inbox. He wasn't going to take anything anymore. They thought the system would keep running. What they didn't realize, it ran because I kept catching its falls. And now I was going to let it fall. That's the thing about silence. It doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it means countdown. They had no idea what I'd built under their noses. No idea how fragile their control really was. And no clue what I was about to do next. So, let me tell you what happened after the text. Let me tell you how it all fell apart. From the inside out. The morning after the wedding, I stared at the ceiling and counted the hours until Lena woke up. She looked peaceful, one arm, over the blanket hair fanned out like a painter's brushstroke across the pillow. I wanted to protect that moment, let it breathe, but my mind wouldn't stop running audits on what just happened. Not on the marriage, on the message. I didn't check the phone again. I didn't need to. The words were already etched into my skull. Effective immediately, your role has been terminated. I poured a cup of black coffee, left the creamer untouched, and stood by the sink watching the steam curl. The wedding gifts were still stacked in the corner, ribbons half-tied, envelopes unopened. But in the back of my head, I was already indexing my access logs, key permissions, asset chains. I knew what they had. I also knew what they didn't understand. 9 years ago, Aperture West was a boutique planning consultancy operating out of a downtown loft, with more exposed brick than clients. They were bleeding contracts because their project workflows couldn't pass city compliance, too slow, too inconsistent, too reactive. I'd come in as a freelancer, built a prototype using cross-department logic nodes, mapped the permit schedules against regional code updates, created a dashboard that predicted project risk by zip code, zoning history, and inspector behavior. By month 6, they offered me a full-time role. By year 2, they were closing city contracts 3 times larger than anything they'd landed before. That system, they named it ARCOS, Aperture Regional Compliance Operating Suite. Sounds sleek, right? But ARCOS wasn't software. Not really. It was a live organism. It needed feeding, tuning, quiet intervention. And I was the only one who could hear it breathe. I still remember the first time I showed Charles Redmond the pilot version. He leaned back in his chair, nodding like he was listening to music only he could hear. This, he said, tapping the keyboard is the difference between being a firm and being a force. He called me the invisible architect. He even sent a thank you letter, one of the only personal memos he ever wrote. I kept it, still folded in the back of the original ARCOS binder. It read, "Some systems are built, some are born. Yours feels like both, CR." And for a while I believed him. I worked nights, skipped weekends, logged 40-hour sprints to fix vendor integrations no one else even understood. I had a dented Lenovo ThinkPad I never upgraded because it still held the route map I built in year 1. Lena hated that thing, said it smelled like solder and stress. "You don't need a title grant," she told me once. "You built the whole damn thing." So, when Preston showed up fresh from some urban redevelopment startup armed with buzzwords and swagger, I figured he'd learn his place, that he'd see the architecture and respect the weight of what came before him. He didn't. He cut 2 team members without consulting me, removed my login from the RFP channel, started calling ARCOS a legacy tool in meetings I wasn't invited to. The moment I should have walked the day he asked me to send over all back-end access logs for review. I should have known what was coming, but I still thought this was salvageable, that someone, maybe Charles, would step in. Charles didn't. He retired 2 weeks later, quietly. That same afternoon, Preston launched an internal newsletter. "Welcome to the new Aperture." There was a sentence that stuck with me. "Our future must be agile, not anchored." Anchored. That was me. Still, I stayed. Because you don't burn down the house you poured your soul into. Because Lena and I had just made the down payment on the Craftsman in Berkeley Hills. Because I wanted to see how long the system would last, without me whispering to it at night. And because deep down, I wanted them to feel it when it failed. ARCOS wasn't sabotage ready, but it could be made fragile, not by breaking it, but by letting it breathe without its architect. I didn't build it to trap anyone, but I built it well enough that I could. The final straw wasn't a meeting. It wasn't even personal. It was a Slack thread, Preston asking a junior engineer how to bypass the submission delay loop on Form 24C. That loop existed to keep us compliant with Section 9B of the East Bay Municipal Code. Removing it would expose the firm to 6-figure penalties. I responded once, explained it in detail. No reaction. 2 hours later, the thread was deleted. So I started copying files, slowly, discreetly, not to steal, not yet, to remember. That binder with Charles's note, I scanned it. The original ARCOS whiteboard photographed it before they wiped the war room. My old ThinkPad. I cloned its brain onto a cold storage drive and buried it under 6 layers of encryption. It wasn't revenge, not yet, but it was preparation. You don't survive 9 years in this industry without knowing how fast the story can turn, and I was done being written out of mine. So, when that wedding night message came in, I didn't panic. I just stood by the sink sipping coffee, listening to the silence. Because that's when I realized it wasn't sabotage I was planning, it was survival. And ARCOS. It was about to show everyone exactly what happened when you fired the one person who could hear it breathe. I was in the middle of restoring the sandbox environment when Preston's name showed up on the access logs. At first I thought it was a mistake, Arcos didn't grant admin level override without dual key clearance, not unless someone bypassed the protocol manually. I pulled the log stream again. There it was, Preston Redmond. 3:16 p.m. Modifications to zone access tiers and audit tracking toggles. I leaned back, closed my laptop, and just sat there. That was the moment it stopped being survivable. Preston had found the override trigger, or more likely, someone had shown it to him. A junior dev, maybe, someone looking to impress him, someone who didn't understand why that part of the framework was left undocumented for a reason. Arcos wasn't fragile, but it was layered meticulously. Compliance visibility wasn't a feature, it was a contract. We weren't just tracking freight routes. We were mapping vendor accountability across 4 state lines with dynamic escalation protocols. And Preston had just turned it into a toy. That afternoon, I didn't say anything. I didn't email him. I didn't alert IT. Instead, I quietly printed a copy of the original 24C zoning escalation loop, the one Charles Redmond had personally approved in 2017. Then I added Preston's edit log beneath it. I didn't need to annotate it. The delta spoke for itself. I slid the printout into the old black binder I kept under my desk, the same one Charles once called my invisible archive. And for the first time since my wedding, I clicked export all. Not sabotage. Not yet. But the moment you change the integrity settings in Arcos, without a change management log, you've signed something you don't understand. 2 days later, Preston fired Lena's old coworker, Cynthia Marcus. She was a zoning auditor, 6 years at Aperture West. No write-ups, no drama. Her restructuring came without a transition plan. Her accounts were folded into Preston's hand-picked analyst team, none of whom had compliance certification. I saw the memo. It was one of those sterile HR emails dressed up like progress. As we realign the Arcos task force toward a more agile framework, we're streamlining redundancy and optimizing cross-functional visibility. It didn't even say her name, but Cynthia was the one who helped me validate the Arcos redundancy path after state legislation changed in 2021. Without her sign-off, we couldn't file certain routes with pre-clearance. Losing her wasn't just disrespect, it was a time bomb. One Preston didn't even know he was sitting on. I texted her, "You okay? I will be." It's not the first time a man's taken credit for something he didn't understand. I sat there looking at that message, the words vibrating in my palm, and I realized Arcos didn't need me to defend it anymore. It needed me to let it speak. That weekend, I opened the terminal window on my ThinkPad, the same one Lena gave me during the pandemic, still dented in the corner from where I dropped it after a board call. I hadn't used the diagnostic shell in months, but it still ran clean. Query.redundancy aux path all at 24C statewide. True export. Delta.sync.conflicts. I encrypted it, burned it to a labeled drive, and stored it with the printed log under the loose floorboard in our laundry room. Just above the boiler. No one ever checked there. Not sabotage. Documentation. Because Preston hadn't just endangered a contract. He'd broken a clause baked into our federal compliance shield, 24CB. The vendor escalation failover had to remain visible and traceable across all admin overrides. His change, technically speaking, voided that clause, which meant any submission using the updated framework legally invalid. And that's when the real shift happened, not in Arcos, not in the company. In me. I'd spent years building something that could withstand turnover, incompetence, even apathy. But I hadn't built it for protection. I'd built it for permanence. So, when someone finally came along and tried to erase me, all I had to do was stop helping. That Monday, Preston stood at the head of the audit huddle and explained our new compliance workflow. I watched one of the newer analysts, Tanner, something nod and take notes like he actually understood the stack trace Preston was misquoting. He was describing a system that didn't exist, and I didn't correct him. I just leaned against the conference table, took a sip of cold coffee, and stared at the screen like I was watching a stranger operate my machinery with a blindfold on. Because in a way they'd taken the engine. But I still had the flight manual, and Preston had no idea how fast that thing was leaking fuel. Ever been in a room full of people pretending they know what they're doing while quietly dismantling the only thing keeping the company operational? It's a weird kind of silence, a doomed one. And I was done breaking that silence for them. I didn't speak up that day, but I did schedule a call with the one vendor Preston hadn't realized Arcos depended on. They hadn't heard from us in weeks. and they had questions. I had answers, but I hadn't even touched the city contracts yet. Not yet. The backup server was humming in the ceiling, ductwork above sub 2, tucked behind insulation and a wall of decoy patch cables. I'd hidden it 6 years ago, one of those paranoid contingencies you never expect to use. But that morning, I keyed in the legacy access code from memory and watched the Arcos mirror come back to life. No interface, no UI, just raw logs, binary checkpoints, and the script I wrote after the last hurricane breach, the one Charles Redmond called the paranoid fallback of a genius with trust issues. He wasn't wrong. I didn't trust Preston, not with my system, not with my people, and definitely not with Cynthia's firing. He'd done it through a scheduling bot, an automated memo marked realignment due to redundancy. Her keycard stopped working before her calendar updated. 31 years, gone in 11 milliseconds. Lena didn't say anything when I told her I was staying through the quarter, just nodded and handed me a cold bag of wedding cake. She knew. We weren't alumni anymore, we were artifacts. Quiet ones. The kind that still had root access in places Preston didn't know existed. I didn't need the whole system, just the heartbeat file, a copy of Arcos's conflict reconciliation log. It was only about 12 megabyte tiny compared to the machine it monitored, but inside that were every override, every skipped warning, every bypass zoning review Preston had touched since May. I encrypted the file 3 ways, once with the original Charles cipher, once with a dynamic salt pulled from an offline entropy table, and once with something personal, a folder labeled June 7 Final. Inside was a snapshot of the vendor clause Preston had quietly stripped out of the downtown transit bids, a subclause tagged 7.14b. That clause required independent audit reviews for any modifications made to zoning overlays using non-local data. Preston bypassed it, twice. Because out-of-state optimization looked better on paper. Because Cynthia would have flagged it. That clause was tied to federal dollars. Meaning, if it was missing during project approval, that wasn't just internal compliance. That was grounds for a clawback. They didn't see it, because they'd stopped reading after the KPI reports. But I had it. I had the clause, the log trail, and thanks to Cynthia's old inbox, I had the original signed version from the city manager's office. Dated, initialed, time-stamped. I didn't print it. I didn't even screenshot it. I moved it to a cold partition, air-gapped the mirror, and shut it all back down. You don't hold a sword by swinging it. You hold it by knowing when not to. The next morning, I brought Preston his requested architecture docs with a smile. He didn't look up, just grunted and asked if I'd found the leak in the backup redundancy logic. Sure, Preston. Let's call it a leak. He told me he'd be reformatting the ArcOS redundancy layer next quarter to make it more vendor-friendly, which is a corporate speak for, I'm gonna gut your design and sell it as mine. I nodded, told him I'd draft some talking points. That made him feel important. I caught Lena that night as she was logging out. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired caffeine fixes, but the kind you get when you're watching something you built get repainted in someone else's colors. They think it's theirs now, she said quietly. They don't know what they're holding, I said. You going to stop it? I shook my head. No, I'm just going to let them keep proving they never deserved it. We sat in silence for a few seconds. Then she handed me an old key card. It still had Charles's initials etched on the back. I found it in my desk. Don't know why I kept it. I nodded and tucked it into my wallet. The magnetic strip probably didn't even work anymore, but it felt grounding. Like a signal that what we built mattered, that someone remembered. The plan wasn't revenge, not yet. It was preservation. I wasn't setting traps. I was preserving the truth because I knew Preston's shortcuts weren't accidents. And once the first one broke ground and the funding hit the audit cycle, someone was going to need a map. And I had it, but I also knew the price. If this got out too soon, it would look personal. A disgruntled architect throwing rocks from the shadows. If it came out too late, the city would be left holding the bag, and people like Cynthia would never get justice. So I waited. I watched. I kept showing up. I let them keep talking. Because every day they used Arcos. Without understanding it, the system was logging what they broke. And eventually someone was going to ask the question, why did the zoning failure cascade start here? And I'd be ready to answer. You ever sit in a meeting where the people in charge are rewriting a map you drew upside down and convincing themselves it's more efficient? I did, every week, quietly, and each time I saved a copy. But the real leverage wasn't in the system. It was buried in the contracts they hadn't read. I was standing in the parking lot behind Aperture West, leaning against my car watching the sun scrape gold off the third-floor windows when it clicked, not like an idea, like a lock. Preston thought he'd fired me, but all he'd done was sever himself from the only person who knew how the infrastructure he bragged about actually ran. I built the compliance engine they were still bragging about at city council meetings, the platform that let them track permitting flows across 3 districts in under 48 hours. Charles Redmond used to joke that my back-end architecture was the only reason we hadn't been sued by the state for zoning misreporting in 2019. And now Preston in his arrogance had no clue I'd baked in redundancy logs, automated self-audits that replicated every back-end submission into a shadow folder. Originally for disaster recovery, quietly expanded later for protection. The clause was buried in a renewal doc with a consulting firm they'd since off-boarded. Section 12B, all transit permit submission, routing logic, remains under internal IP control as implemented by original architect. Modification requires audit clearance by original system lead or certified equivalent. That lead me. I remember the day I wrote that clause. It was a rainy Wednesday. Charles was in New York and Preston had tried to get my credentials suspended after I flagged a fake vendor markup he'd approved. I didn't escalate it. I just tightened the bolts. Back then I still believed in preservation. Now I understood leverage. They could still use the system, but if they changed anything touched one line of logic, city workflows would stall. I'd written the dependencies to fail, gracefully, but silently. They'd keep thinking submissions were going through until the first project stalled at inspection. I didn't need to sabotage anything. I just needed to stop maintaining the trap I'd already designed to catch liars. Preston had never asked how the dashboard compiled its reports. He loved screenshots, not architecture. And the day he cut me loose, he unknowingly created a compliance dead zone with my name on the only working key. I sat in my car engine off, fingers on the wheel, not moving, just breathing it in. The anger wasn't hot anymore. It was cold, settled. I wasn't going to torch anything. I wasn't going to march into HR or leak a memo to the Times. I was going to let their next mistake land on the trapdoor I'd already locked years ago. I didn't need to fight back. I just needed them to remember who built it. Hit like and subscribe if you've lived that truth too. That weekend I reached out to Camille Ortega. She used to run ethics compliance for the Portland Municipal Board. We'd crossed paths back in 2018 when Aperture was trying to recover from a missed fire code integration. Camille didn't ask many questions, just said, "You tell me when you want to start your own thing. I've been waiting." The only thing more fragile than Preston's ego was the system he thought he controlled, and I was done being quiet about either. I started sketching a new architecture that weekend. Something transparent, modular, verifiable. Not for Aperture, for what came next. Because one small log file had just told me everything I needed to know. The last 3 permit audits they filed, each routed through a ghost node I decommissioned in March. Meaning, they were forging compliance reports. They just didn't know I could prove it. And I wasn't going to show my hand. Not yet. I'd let Preston keep swinging. He was going to hang himself on a system he never understood. Next week I'd see the first cracks. And when I did, I'd be ready. Because silence isn't weakness, it's aim. And mine was getting steadier by the hour. Now they were playing by my rules. They just didn't know it yet. And that audit trail, it was about to lead them straight into a wall. Stay with me. You'll want to hear what I found next. I got the first text from Harper at 10:17 a.m. Grant, did you touch the staging config? 3 minutes later, demo servers aren't syncing across time zones. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't know what she was talking about, but because I did. Exactly. The heartbeat delay. The 6-second gap I'd hard-coded to force a compliance resync only if someone manually authenticated it. No one ever asked what would happen if that delay stacked across global time zones. And frankly, I wasn't in a hurry to volunteer the answer. I made myself a coffee, sat at my desk, and just watched. By 10:24, the Tokyo nodes had dropped offline. By 10:32, London's dashboard flagged stale sync data. By 10:38, Chicago's staging cluster panicked and locked out half the VP team from their mobile demo environment. And by 10:41, Connexus sent a quiet message to Michael Ung asking if they needed to reschedule Monday's walkthrough. No one CC'd me, not yet. I didn't feel giddy or smug or anything Hollywood might have sold you. I just felt still. Because I hadn't touched anything since leaving, the system wasn't breaking. It was running exactly as built, just without the patch I used to apply every Friday night before global rollout. One script, one approval key, the kind you don't include in the SOP docs because it's temporary, the kind you document in the margins of a meeting with a pen that runs out of ink. That's what broke. And somehow, no one had noticed it was missing until I stopped showing up. Preston didn't call, he didn't email, he didn't Slack. Instead, he summoned Jason Liu, who hadn't touched back-end scheduling in 2 years, and told him to stabilize it. Jason, bless him, tried, but the system wasn't destabilized. It was just clean. No duct tape, no override, just every assumption exposed. By lunchtime, I was already getting screenshots from old colleagues, screens blinking red, Slack threads spiraling. No one blamed me, but they were realizing someone had held this together with invisible thread. And now that thread was gone. I'd written the whole thing in modular blocks. Every audit sync, every compliance ping, every external handoff, they all relied on a specific cascade. But I'd never documented what I did to make it seamless, because back then I didn't think I needed to. Back then I assumed I'd be in the room. It's strange watching something you built collapse in slow motion, not because it's faulty, but because it's pure, stripped of every compromise you ever made to protect someone else's ego. The system was finally honest, which meant the house of cards was too. I'd warned Preston once in my exit email. Just make sure the heartbeat interval is maintained if you're demoing across international nodes. He never replied. I doubt he even read it. But now the heartbeat was silent, and everyone could hear the echo. Because what happened next didn't involve code. It involved people, blame, panic, posturing. And when Monday's board demo arrived, it didn't crash. But the trust, the illusion. That's what buckled. I didn't build this system to fail, but I also didn't build it for Preston. Not anymore. Next week's board demo wasn't going to crash, but the question was, who'd still be standing when it didn't? I showed up to the boardroom 15 minutes early. Not because I was nervous, though maybe I was, but because I wanted to hear the silence. You can tell a lot from an empty boardroom. The hush before a demo, the hum of the monitors, the echo of someone's last mistake. There was a handout on the table, glossy, branded, Connexus Systems Strategic Roadmap, authored by Preston Vale. My name wasn't on it, which was funny considering it was built on the infrastructure I designed, still running on the rules I wrote. By 9:00 a.m., the directors filed in suits tablets that practiced corporate nod. Preston entered last, flanked by Dana from Ops, and some junior PM he barely remembered to introduce. And when he stood up to speak, it was like watching a kid rehearse someone else's speech. All cadence, no conviction. Today, he said, we unveil the migration framework that positions Arc Suite for global readiness. They nodded, clicked pens, one even sipped espresso like it was wine. No one questioned it, not yet, until Preston opened the dashboard, and it didn't match the packet. You could see it in his eyes, that split second of, oh no, before he tried to cover it with jargon. The dashboard showed something else, an audit trail I'd embedded 6 months ago. The metadata was time-stamped, versions that didn't exist in his paper trail, migrations that had been delayed, compliance flags silently triggered. Dana leaned forward. Is this live? Preston blinked. It's a shadow environment, for modeling. It's our production backend, I said. That got them. Foreheads turned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. There's a system clause in our ISO documentation. Section 7.3.1. No deployment masking allowed during board demo presentations. That dashboard, that's the real system unmasked. Preston's face tightened. We agreed to hide the latency cycle. You did. I didn't. There was a moment, one long silent breath. Then the CTO spoke. Why are there rollback logs dated last week? Who approved that? Preston didn't answer, and I just sat there calm, controlled, watching the storm build with all the patience of a man who'd built the lightning rod and knew exactly when the sky would crack. You ever watch someone realize they're standing in a house made of glass? Right as the first stone hits. I thought about the terminal delay from last week, the 6-second silence. It hadn't been a bug. It was a memory, a callback. I'd written it into the shell environment years ago. If any critical systems were reverted without documentation, the delay would propagate across all active sessions. A polite way of saying, you forgot to cover your tracks. And Preston had forgotten. I could see Dana scrolling now, pinching and zooming the audit trail, her brow furrowed. Not just performance data license reassignments, contract void flags, delayed vendor invoices. All of it real, all of it time-stamped, all of it linked to his credentials. He knew he was caught, and yet he still tried. "I don't think Grant should be here," he said, turning to the chair. The chair didn't look up from the screen. "Grant built it," he said quietly. "You didn't. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe. Not all the way, but enough. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the audit, and audits don't punish. They expose. Sometimes silence is louder than confession. And sometimes justice doesn't come with an explosion, just a timestamp and a room full of witnesses. That morning I didn't argue. I didn't gloat. I just let the data speak. I built the truth into the system. All I had to do was let it breathe. And it did. Right there in front of the board. I'm not sure if you've ever had to sit in a room while someone else presented your work and failed to understand it. But if you've ever felt that particular mix of betrayal and calm vengeance, then you know how quiet revenge can be. That boardroom never felt the same after that day. And neither did Preston. Oh, have you ever been in a room where your silence hit harder than their speech? Where you didn't have to prove anything, because they proved it for you? If that moment lives in your memory too, like an itch behind your ribs, then you understand exactly what happened that morning. And maybe you'll understand what's coming next. Because the system didn't just audit Preston. It exposed someone else too, someone higher. And that's where this story turns. So stick around. Have you ever had your work hijacked by someone who didn't even understand it? Leave a comment if you've lived that frustration. And if you're ready to see how this power game ends, hit like, subscribe. Don't miss what happens next. Someone above Preston signed off on the cover-up. And the next board meeting isn't just a demo. It's a reckoning. This wasn't a movie ending. It wasn't even revenge, really. It was reality recalibrating itself. The matchbox. I'd left it sitting where it always had been, nested inside a buried protocol, inside the compliance sandbox I built 6 years ago. Brent just struck the match. When his name went live on the security audit logs, when the download timestamp matched the restricted folder, I didn't need to say a word. Our internal policy section 9.4.2 doesn't make exceptions for family members, not even executive ones. That morning, I watched the InfoSec team do exactly what we'd trained for, flag the behavior, revoke the credentials, auto-escalate to third-party compliance. I'd written those steps to protect the company. Brent assumed they didn't apply to him. He was wrong. The strangest part, I didn't feel triumphant, just still. Like I'd been holding my breath for months, and now I didn't need to anymore. Brent stood in the server corridor staring at the red access lockout on his tablet like he'd never seen policy enforcement before. He tried calling in a favor from Leon up in infrastructure. Didn't work. Leon called legal instead. Then came the real fallout. The compliance firm began its own digital trace. IP address confirmations, access logs, server-side capture on document exports. The deeper they looked, the more curious they became. I didn't have to nudge them. Just watch. And when the audit trail linked back to a personal Gmail forwarding rule, the expression on Brent's face changed. Not anger, not panic. Recognition. He finally understood. This wasn't about a line of code or a botched transfer. This was about consequence. About policy applying evenly. About legacy being earned, not inherited. And the company, it didn't collapse. But it did slow down like a train that suddenly realized there was no one left at the controls who actually knew the route. There's a quiet kind of justice in letting the system speak for you. And Brent, he finally heard it. The press didn't need much help. Once the internal emails leaked specifically, the thread where Brent approved a supplier contract, 3 levels above his clearance, it was only a matter of time. But I'll admit, I didn't expect the red banner to hit so fast. He showed up that morning with his usual swagger, but something had shifted. The receptionist didn't buzz him through. The badge reader blinked red, twice, then again. It was subtle, almost polite, a soft denial of access quiet, like how rot seeps into wood. By 10:30, the board had convened a private session. Not the full board, just the compliance subcommittee and 2 outside counsel I didn't recognize. HR called it an emergency audit alignment. Everyone else just called it Thursday. I didn't speak in that meeting. I didn't need to. Brent tried to argue, intent claimed he was set up, that the logs didn't reflect real context, but the chain of approvals in the system, That was mine. I had built it, and every deviation was time-stamped, sourced, and locked behind zero-trust authentication. His fingerprint was the only one that triggered those override flags. And then came the board vote. It wasn't a termination, not at first. It was a temporary leave-pending investigation, wrapped in legalese thick enough to smother a bonfire. But Brent's face he knew. We all did. You don't come back from this kind of paper trail. They asked me if I'd seen it coming, and I told them the truth no. But I knew exactly where to look once it started burning. What I didn't say was I had rehearsed this moment in silence for weeks. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the silence to end. This wasn't about access rights or audit violations anymore. It was about what it feels like when someone strips your name from the thing you spent years building, when they use your work as a ladder, then call it obsolete while they're still climbing. So, when Brent walked out of that conference room, pale and wordless, past the same receptionist who once worshipped his last name, I didn't feel triumph. I felt gravity. He paused at the door like he expected someone to follow. No one did. Later that night, an internal memo circulated from HR quietly stating that Mr. Brent Halden will be on indefinite leave to support the company's review of internal controls. And beneath that, a footnote about system integrity review led by Grant Halden. That's when I realized I hadn't erased him. I had just brought the room back into focus. Do you know what it's like to watch someone fall in slow motion after they spent months convincing everyone you were the weight? Because that's what this was. Slow motion, methodical, undeniable. Next came the clients, then the auditors, then the call I'd been expecting for years. But that's not the part you need to hear yet. You need to understand what the red flag on Brent's name really meant, because that detail, that wasn't policy. That was personal. 3 days after the systems failure hit the wire, I got a call from an unfamiliar number 1 of those internal extensions I used to dial in my sleep. It was Cynthia Rowe, interim VP of Ops, and someone I used to eat lunch with once a week, back when people still smiled in that office. Her voice was tight-clipped, but not unkind. Grant, you probably saw the coverage. We're trying to stabilize. The boards, well, they've made some decisions, and your name came up. I leaned against the window ledge of my apartment, the same ledge where I stood the day I was fired, watching traffic blur below, like my thoughts. They want to bring you back in, she said. Not full-time, not right away, but consultative, 6-month retainer, help us rebuild the protocols, maybe reassess Halden's influence. She didn't say Brent's name, but she didn't have to. There was silence on my end. I could feel it, the shift, not just the apology wrapped in policy speak, but the weight behind it, the unspoken acknowledgement. They didn't want me. They needed me. Grant, they're ready to issue a statement acknowledging your role in the system's architecture. There's talk of renaming the infrastructure backbone in your name. We'll call it the Halden layer. You'd be compensated appropriately, of course. The Halden layer. I nearly laughed. The irony. For 6 years, that system kept them afloat. And for 3 months, it kept me sane. I thought about the whiteboard sketches in my garage, the backups I maintained, the lines of code I'd written in airports and hospital waiting rooms, pretending it didn't sting that no one cared. You know what I want, Cynthia, I said finally. What's that? I want to know how many people in that room stood up when Brent fired me. Not after, not in Slack, in the moment. She paused. None. There it was. That's the truth I needed, not a plaque, not a retainer. Just the confirmation that silence has weight. I'm not coming back, I said, but I hope whoever you hire next, I hope you listen to them before it's too late. Another pause, then quietly, understood. When the call ended, I stood there staring at my reflection in the glass. Older, calmer, not proud, just clear. I didn't burn the place down. I just turned off the part that kept it alive. And now they wanted to name it after me. That night I opened a folder I hadn't touched in months. A letter from a startup in Boston. They'd been watching the collapse. Your architecture saved a failing system. We believe it can build a future one. Let's talk. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. But for the first time in a long time, I felt still. There's something different about justice when it arrives, not with applause, but with quiet. And when you finally realize you never needed their seat. You were the table. And what happened next would finally show what that cost me. I didn't go to the launch. Didn't need to. I already knew what would happen. But I did read the press release buried between recycled jargon and desperate optimism. They called it a proud return to scalable, secure infrastructure inspired by earlier Halden-era protocols. They didn't even bother changing the name. The Halden layer, my layer. 6 months after Brent tried to purge my codebase, Halvix quietly reinstated the framework I'd built, not because they wanted to, but because the replacement system had failed compliance review for the 3rd time in a row. Internal documentation leaked to clients one by one. Brent blamed the team, then the consultants, then rumor has it, even the auditors. But when you build something real, something that works, it doesn't go away just because someone with a louder voice tells it to. It survives. At the West Coast Enterprise Security Conference, one of the breakout panels was titled Legacy Resilience: How Internal Frameworks Can Outlive Politics. The panel lead, a vendor I once onboarded during a rainstorm at 2 a.m., back when no one at Halvix would take the call. He mentioned me by name. We still call it the Halden backbone internally. The structure was too elegant to scrap. Meanwhile, Brent didn't show. Word was the board had reassigned him indefinitely. Translation exile without drama. They never issued a formal statement, just quietly removed his profile from the leadership page and repurposed his corner office into a hybrid collaboration hub. Angela texted me a photo of the newly printed training manual, section 4.1, grants redundancy protocols. Still there, still saving them from themselves. And me, I was on a walk with Sophia when the news broke. She was tugging on my sleeve, asking if I thought ducks dream. I smiled and told her I hoped so. I didn't mention the conference or the panel or the manual, because this wasn't about legacy anymore. It was about clarity. The code I left behind outlived the man who erased me, and that was enough. Almost. But then something strange happened, something I hadn't anticipated. An email, not from a vendor, not from a colleague, from the last person I expected. And that changed everything. I've had time to think about the moment it all came down, about the man who stood in front of a collapsing system still clutching his last name like it was a shield, and about the silence that followed. Brent never apologized, never called, never asked how the system he bragged about controlling turned to dust beneath his watch. But that's the thing with people like him. They think legacy is inherited. I know now it has to be built, and I didn't build mine for them. The night after everything was finalized, I sat across from Lauren in our new apartment. Just the two of us. No crisis alerts, no wedding postponements, no smug execs calling me pal like I was disposable. Just quiet. She handed me a photo. I didn't even know she'd saved me in the server room years ago, grinning like an idiot next to the first iteration of Sentinel. The corner was torn. The ink was faded. But for the first time in months, I saw something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not in the revenge. In the restraint. In walking away when I could have pushed harder. When I could have ruined lives, not just careers, but I didn't want scorched earth. I just wanted clarity. To know I wasn't crazy. That I saw what was broken and tried to fix it. And when they chose power over people, I let the consequences write their own report. A few weeks ago, I got an email from a junior engineer I used to mentor. She said, "We kept the protocols you wrote. We use them every day. You should know that." I read it 3 times. There's no Forbes article, no plaque, no LinkedIn post with 80,000 likes. But there's that, and that's enough. Looking back, I don't think Brent ever really fired me. He just made it official that I was never one of them. And honestly, thank God. Because now, I'm finally building something that matters. Something I don't have to protect from people like him. Something I can pass on not out of revenge, but out of peace. Have you ever had to walk away from something you built just to protect your own future? I'd love to hear your story. And if you want more stories about how we reclaim what's ours, subscribe, stick around.